Excellency, distinguished delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and students. Well, they will show up. We are most pleased to welcome you to our 27th Annual Conference at the United Nations on the topic of health and environment, Global Partners for Global Solutions, which is co-sponsored by the government of Ukraine, our co-sponsor since 1992, and supported by the International Council of Women, the NGO Committee on Sustainable Development, New York, and World Association of NGOs. Today, I would like to begin with a quote: "Progress is in the eyes of the beholder." Which began in 1987, following the catastrophe in Chernobyl on April 26, 1986, with its mission of bringing scientifically relevant information to promote a healthy environment for all. We are grateful to the government of Ukraine and His Excellency Volodymyr Yeltsin for supporting our mission, and to the faculty that will enlighten you this morning. Our global population in sheer numbers is larger than any point in human history. 1 billion people is added to our planet approximately every 12 years since 1950, which is challenging the Earth's carrying capacities to sustain civilization. However, average global family size has decreased, and fertility rates have fallen in most developed countries. People on the average are living longer, healthier, and safer lives. There are fewer deaths from illness and starvation, fewer extremely poor, more literate people, and certainly more people connected by telephone, the internet, and transportation. The tendency to focus only on persistent problems can blind those who seek to repair the world from observing and supporting progressive change, such as United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. And SDG 7, energy, is on our agenda today. We will hear about the transformation happening in Chernobyl, the raison d'etre of why world information transfer began, and how energy, or lack of it, is transforming our world. Even where progress occurs, many ignore it. Across the globe, 60% of people surveyed, including the US, thought that their nation was moving in the wrong direction, according to Vox. But globally, deaths from starvation have been reduced to 6/100ths of the risk 60 years ago. This success is a result of establishing a global famine early warning system and humanitarian efforts around the globe. 2017 also saw fewer fatalities from natural disasters, according to the international database, despite Hurricanes Maria and Irma. Infectious disease continues to decline globally, largely due to vaccination efforts. Solar power continues to expand as a source of energy, as does wind and geothermal energy. And finally, progress in human rights has grown in all regions of the world, though certainly not in every country. Focusing only on progress would produce an overly optimistic view, just as a focus on problems alone produces an overly pessimistic perception of the state of our world today. Inspiration to improve the lives of others comes in part from a belief that progress is possible. Wars, one could argue, have to be expected and accepted as part of the human condition, because anger derives from a core element in the human psyche, and the lack of attention to the emotional and physical needs of every child born is still prevalent. Evolutionary change would have to occur for war and child neglect to disappear. Yet, limiting conflict and mitigating its results have been achieved, thanks in large measure to the efforts of the United Nations. The UN itself represents human progress, symbolized by the ceiling in the ECOSOC chamber. The chamber's architect, Sven Markelius, intentionally left part of the ceiling unfinished, as a reminder that the work of repairing the economic and social ills of the world will be ongoing. Achieving positive change and perceiving it as progress in any sector occurs over time and requires both patience, balanced assessment, and the willingness to change our perceptions and beliefs. I would like to end with a quote from Charles Darwin. "Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. It is those who know little, not those who know much, who positively assert that problems can never be solved by science." Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Our next speaker is His Excellency Volodymyr Yerchenko, the permanent representative of the government of Ukraine to the United Nations. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Christina. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, at the outset, let me thank Dr. Christine Durbach of the World International Transfer Conference Chair and Founder for being our supporter and partner for so many fruitful years. I would also like to welcome our distinguished speakers of today. I am pleased that Ukraine has a long-lasting tradition of co-hosting this essential open dialogue at the United Nations that give us an opportunity to discuss a number of the most relevant items of the international, national, and regional importance. As Dr. Durbach already mentioned, this year our focus is in conjunctions with the UN 2030 Agenda targeting Sustainable Development Goal 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. The approach of the new United Nations system must ensure comprehensive consideration of security, social, and environmental aspects, particularly in priority areas such as ecological safety, comprehensive environmental conservation, and risk reduction management. Only such approach will facilitate sustainability and efficiency of the developing world. This issue is of special importance for my country. As you all know, yesterday, the international community commemorated the 32nd year of the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear disaster in the history of mankind that has led to the loss of human lives, huge irreversible health, environmental, and economic consequences. It occurred on 26 April 1986 near the city of Pripyat in Ukraine, which was under the direct jurisdiction of the central authorities of the former Soviet Union. Before the disaster, the city had a population of about 50,000 people. Now it is a lifeless shadow of the ghastly nuclear catastrophe, one of only two rated at a 7 on the International Atomic Energy Agency scale. It had a serious political and security impact and changed attitudes towards many aspects of the day-to-day life, in particular to the nuclear energy industry and its safeguards. In modern history of Ukraine, the scale of the catastrophe can be compared only to the Great Famine of 1933, Holodomor, the Second World War, and the ongoing Russian aggression in Crimea and the east of Ukraine. For 32 years, Ukraine has made every effort to improve the well-being of affected communities and revive the economic potential of the affected areas. This catastrophe disrupted the livelihoods of almost 2 million people in more than 2,000 locations. Strengthening the resilience of affected communities and restoration of their self-reliance is the foundation for the sustainable development and our absolute priority. In this regard, we are thankful for productive collaboration with the United Nations. Supported by UN agencies, Ukraine has successfully implemented a number of international projects aimed at sustained recovery and development of the affected areas. Dear colleagues, by all means, the shift from restoration of the area to its sustainable socio-economic development can only take place if radiation safety requirements are fully met. Therefore, Ukraine places emphasis on converting the shelter facility into an environmentally safe system and concluding the construction of the new safe confinement. In November 2016, the new safe confinement was erected. This construction project is unprecedented in the history of engineering. Never before has such a huge structure been constructed at a heavily contaminated site. The next step is the completion of the construction and commissioning of the facility. Having completed this work, we will create all conditions for the implementation of another ambitious project, the installation of land-based solar panels in the Chernobyl exclusive zone. A month ago, a preliminary feasibility study on the installation of the solar panels was presented. The potential demand for electricity is bigger than originally estimated and can be up to 1.2 gigawatts of initial power. The study takes into account the features of the territory, the level of radioactive contamination, where the plant location of solar energy facilities will be located, the rules of radiation safety during the work, and many other aspects. Let me mention another important aspect of the topic we discuss now. As of today, the global terrorist threat within the peaceful nuclear development is an emerging international issue. Therefore, Ukraine welcomes the focus of the international community on the physical protection of nuclear material. In this regard, the Chernobyl international cooperation may also include aspects of the scientific and security-infused cooperation under the coordination of the International Atomic Energy Agency and other UN bodies. Understanding the long-term nature of the implications of the Chernobyl accident, we find it essential to continue collaboration with the United Nations and other international organizations regarding the study and minimization of health, environmental, and socio-economic consequences of the disaster. One of the primary lessons of Chernobyl was that the world should stay vigilant and united facing such disasters, something that was proved, for instance, by the Fukushima nuclear accident back in 2011. Despite the considerable progress in rehabilitation of the affected areas, much remains to be done. The Chernobyl legacy will linger for a long while, and we should never forget about that. So I'm convinced that we must continue to carry out various events within the UN system just like you do right now. In this light, I would like to inform you that next week the Permanent Mission of Ukraine will be hosting a photo series exhibition featuring Volodymyr Dyagil, a talented young Ukrainian photographer. Some of his works were supposed to be displayed today. Yes, they are. You can see them. The exhibition entitled Chernobyl Irreversibility is dedicated to the 32nd anniversary of the nuclear catastrophe. With this in mind, I'm using this opportunity to invite you to the opening ceremony, which will take place next Tuesday, May 1st at 1:30 p.m. by the south wall of the conference building on the first floor. I tried just to shape the main ideas of the Ukrainian delegation in the United Nations on the issue, and now I guess that it is time to listen to the views and approaches of my colleagues. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And if you do not mind, we will distribute your speech and bio later, because we're very, very short of time. So
Okay.
I do hope that you'll forgive me. Our next speaker is Honorary Carolyn Komita. Mrs. Komita, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach. And Dr. Durbach, I would also like to thank you for 27 years of bringing us together at the Health and Environment Conference, focusing on shaping a healthy future for our children. And also would like to thank Your Excellency, Mr. Yelchenko. I also welcome students from Chester County, Pennsylvania, who have been coming to our conferences for 27 years since 1992. I would also like to welcome and introduce Colleen Engvall, who is the research analyst of Pennsylvania's Joint Legislative Conservation Committee, of which I am a member. and is the topic of my brief presentation this morning. Chernobyl, the Chernobyl disaster, nuclear disaster, occurred 7 years after a Pennsylvania near nuclear disaster occurred at 3 Mile Island. So there is a connection between Ukraine and Pennsylvania. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing in Pennsylvania, and I hope it will be applicable to other states, other countries as well. This year is the 50th anniversary of Pennsylvania's Joint Legislative Conservation Committee, a small state agency that you've probably never heard of. However, I believe this organization, which was operating at its peak during the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl nuclear disasters, has valuable lessons for the modern conservation world. The committee, which I am now serving as a legislative member, is bipartisan, serving both Democrat and Republican members of the Pennsylvania legislature. In today's especially contentious political climate, it might surprise you how much we've been able to accomplish. During the 60s and 70s, the committee was instrumental in remediating the dangerously polluted environment. Here are a few examples of the committee's accomplishments. I'll be focusing just briefly on two. The Waste Tires Recycling Act, and most importantly, the Environmental Rights Amendment to the Pennsylvania Constitution. Next slide. The Waste Tires Recycling Act of 1996 was drafted by the Joint Legislative Committee to address the millions of illegally dumped tires which were littered across streams and forests across Pennsylvania. The act passed both chambers unanimously and highlighted the ideal balance between environmental and economic responsibility. Next slide. As I said, perhaps the most notable achievement of the committee is the ratification of Pennsylvania's Environmental Rights Amendment in 1971. Next slide. Article 1, Section 27 of Pennsylvania's state constitution entrusts the protection and maintenance of the environment to the Commonwealth for both current citizens and for future generations. Just 8 years after the ratification of this amendment, Pennsylvania bore witness to the nuclear accident and near disaster at 3 Mile Island. 7 years later, in Chernobyl, the international community saw a similar distrust and backlash after the horrific incident there. In places with strong democratic institutions and citizens' rights, environmental protections can help establish accountability as well as consequences. Recently, Pennsylvania has begun citing its own amendment. Incredibly, the first major use of the amendment was almost 50 years after its inception. Act 13 of 2012 delegated most power over natural gas drilling to the state government rather than the local municipalities. The decision gave municipalities the ability to use zoning to protect their citizens' health and their natural resources. In 2008, slightly before that, the amendment was cited again concerning natural gas drilling, where the court ruled that funds gathered from natural gas drilling must be used to mitigate the impacts of such operations. The funds had to be used for environmental purposes, not to just deposit into the general fund. Last slide. As of today, the amendment has not yet been used in a broader context, but we shall see how these developments evolve in the years to come. Environmental rights are vital to our citizens' well-being. Laws and regulations can be amended or repealed, which is why a constitutional guarantee for access to healthy, natural resources is vital for both the environment and the humans that depend on it. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Mrs. Kumera and Dr. Bernstein. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Dorback. It is an honor to have worked with you these past 27 years on this conference and to acknowledge your incredible leadership to have made this happen. And great thanks, of course, to Ukraine and to His Excellency Vladimir Yelchenko for their sponsorship through these many years of the program. I'm very happy to follow the Honorable Karen Kamina as a citizen of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It is one of the few very good things we've had politically occur in recent years as her election as an Assembly representative. My talk is going to focus on the sort of introduction overview of the interface between sustainability, energy, and human health. The good news is that I originally had 25 minutes, and with the addition of so many excellent speakers, I've been cut down to 15. So I'm going to do this by take this enormously large effort and concentrate a little bit on shale gas to try to make an example. And again, this has been introduced very well by Assemblywoman Kamina. One of the key issues that we have in trying to understand what's happening here is to try to focus on what are the underlying major points that are a part of the process of considering energy, sustainability, and health. How do these all work together? And the answer is with great difficulty in many times. The issues that are particularly important for us that we have to deal with are very often issues that seem to come at different directions from different people looking at it, different UN groups looking at issues of this type. When we start going back and think about the role of the United Nations in sustainability, well, it's a very important one. Agenda 21 came out of the United Nations and came out of an approach to look at sustainability and what it meant to all of the nations of the world. If you look at the document that came out of that, the Agenda 21 document, there are, I believe, 31 different chapters. Not one of them relates to energy by itself. But if you look at where energy is in each of the 31 chapters, it's present in almost all of them as a major determinant of that particular issue and sustainability, whether it be agriculture or just pick whatever issue you want to look at. So this trying to put energy in the interface with sustainability and all of the sustainability issues is really a very broad topic. Here are a couple of major points I'd like to focus on. Energy obviously is central to sustainability, requires consideration of future generations, which is sustainability's key approach. And again, if you look at the shale gas issues in the United States and you look at it around the world and the discussions of sustainability, discussions of shale gas, should we or should we not drill, there's almost no mention of future generations. I defy you to find that in the pro or con deliberations about this. Healthy humans are central to setting and achieving sustainability goals. That seems obvious, but frankly, when the Agenda 21 was put together in the 1990s, there was quite a debate as to whether human health was part of the three legs of sustainability: economy, environment, social. Did that include health? Was health different? Health is part of it, and I think we understand that much better now. We have lots of trouble predicting energy sources, supplies. I can tell you that in the late 70s, I gave lots of talks in which I speculated on what it meant that in 30 years there'd be no more oil. Everybody knew that. It was all the analyses by all the major international organizations, by the petroleum industry itself. Well, we ran out of oil 10 years ago, I guess. We've all heard about peak oil. A little less argument about that and wondering about that because we realize it isn't quite peak, and part of that has to do with the shale gas findings. So, again, can we really predict the future? I'll give a little more on that. We sometimes think of sustainability as being sort of the end goal. It's going to be this wonderful world of sustainable development. No, it's never going to be stable. It's a process. It's not an endpoint. The world will always be changing. Global climate change is going to make that happen if we think of nothing else. But there will always be new things. There will be innovations. Humans will always innovate. These will affect all sorts of things, including certainly energy supply. And innovative technology is key. Dr. Durbach, in her introductory remarks, pointed out the need to balance the potential important positive things that can happen from innovation, including, we hope, in wind and solar and other non-fossil fuel sources of energy. But we have to balance it with the potential adverse effects. So these are all general. Definitions. I think we all know the sustainability definition. I won't read it to you, except that last part which I underlined, which I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Everybody who's opposed to sustainability, please raise their hand. Nobody, huh? That's, if you will, part of the problem. This is a difficult, challenging time on our planet. We will not get through the process of sustainability, we will not meet our goals unless it's going to bite somewhere and someone, and we can expect opposition because it's biting, whether it comes from the fossil fuel industry or elsewhere. We're certainly seeing that here in the United States, but it's seen all over the world. We need to basically get out of this sort of cloud, oh, isn't this going to be wonderful, to think of the fact that there are going to be winners and losers, and that this needs to be part of our planning, part of what we do. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. That's something that we expect all public health students to almost have memorized, and to just sort of, you press a button on them and they will come out with this definition. It's a very important definition in terms of health. It means it's not just that people shouldn't be sick, it's that people should be well enough to participate in their society in ways that lead to sustainable development. One of the issues with sustainability and with there being opponents is that we've, at least in the United States, and also I see this elsewhere, sort of gone over toward speaking more of resilience at times than we speak of sustainability. What's the difference? And really, they're very much related, but they are different. And I like this definition of sustainability that comes out of the engineering field, which basically says, think of the old proverb about is the glass, that a pessimist thinks the glass is half empty and an optimist thinks the glass is half full. To an engineer, to someone interested in sustainability, the glass is twice the size that it needs to be. Okay? And we don't need that extra glass. But we do if we're going to be resilient, because the amount in that glass is not going to stay stable. It's always going to be increasing, decreasing. We need enough to be able to cover these perturbations that are inevitable, but we're not sure how much we need. And again, if we think of the relationship between resilience and sustainability, I think we have to focus on what it is that we need. Resilient communities are particularly important. These are community issues. They anticipate risk, they limit impacts, recover quickly, successfully adapt. And the successful adaptation, again, is the challenge is there. We must be able to deal with these issues because we are going to have adverse events and changes. We're having them already now for lots of different things. If you look at the UN Sustainability Development Goals 7, this is a variety. There's sustainability goals that the UN has put together as part of the Millennium Assessment Program. The 2017 report talks about the energy progress. In every area of sustainable energy progress falls short. That's the key point. We're simply not making the progress we need. Meaningful improvements will require higher levels of financing, bolder policy commitments, together with the willingness of countries, and that's my emphasis here, to embrace new technologies on a much wider scale. This is something that we have to keep in mind, because when we do talk about new technologies, we're also talking about new threats to the environment, to human health, that we have to balance somehow, and achieving that balance is difficult. Stepping back from how we go about doing this, just think of within the United States, and you can trace this in other countries throughout the world, and I won't talk about the precautionary principle, which may get into this, but how do we deal with environmental problems? Well, one way to deal with this is to basically have sort of, if you see something bad, you're going to get rid of it. So if there's smoke coming out of a smokestack, it's gone. We will command and control, stop putting that smoke out of that smokestack. Another is that we'll focus on risk assessment and risk management. After we sort of got the major sources, we realized that there were things we couldn't see, smell, touch, that were risky in the environment, and developed the risk assessment and risk management. We still do command and control, but we're now trying to segue into sustainability. And there was a specific approach that was taken in the last administration. The National Academy of Sciences was asked to look at how the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency could act in a sustainable fashion, and it comes down to there's a whole bunch of formulas in there and all sorts of processes and frameworks. But the bottom guiding principle is that an EPA employee should go into an issue where there's potential risk and consider not only how to minimize risk, but how to maximize benefit. And that includes working across, trading off if necessary, the economy, the environment, and social health issues. Can we do that? It's not easy. Well, shale oil, how does that fit in there? Here's this unexpected result of hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas. We went in 1973 from an oil embargo in which President Nixon said within 10 years we'll never have this happen again because we will be energy independent. But in fact, we went from 30% of oil imported to as high of 65% of oil imported. Now we're down to a net import of about 15%, and it's net because we're actually exporting as well as importing. So we're, the United States, sort of energy independent, but that's just the United States. There are other issues that are occurring. Just the availability of energy changes such a thing. Here are the energy sources around the world, but I thought I'd put up a slide of this particular one. I mean, who would have thought a few years ago that Israel and Egypt would be having an energy deals? And this is because the Israelis have natural gas off of their coast. Well, what's that going to mean in terms of a whole series of security issues, and everything from Hezbollah getting a submarine, perhaps? I mean, there are all sorts of things that are happening in the world because energy supplies are changing, and the energy need is there. And this idea that in 30 years there'll be no more oil, gosh, it's harder and harder to sustain that. Well, but what are the issues here? We've got issues that are potential problems. This is just, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the schematic geology of natural gas resources. We're talking about the second, if you will, derrick from the right, the second one above there, where instead of where you have a pipe that goes deep underground, it basically gets into a shale layer. It's then bent. The technology is incredible. This is all being done without anyone seeing it directly. Holes are then blown in the pipe. Stuff is put down, hydraulic fracturing fluid is put down, and a pressure is put on it, and suddenly you've got shale gas coming out. It's going deeper and deeper. The lateral portions are getting further and further as the technology increases. We don't know where the end is. We have people, and I spoke to one who I greatly respect earlier today, who basically says we should stop this now because of the trade-off issues. First, you can argue that an industry does, that there's possible benefits of shale gas, there's economic well-being, contribution to energy independence, there's a decrease in the coal-fired pollutants that can come out. There's obviously lots of problems, though. There's local and regional, there's all sorts of pollutants that come out of this, there's noise, truck traffic, diverse psychosocial and community impacts, and there's the global issues. Is this the best way to get us to an we won't have global climate change because we're finally past the peak and down a few decades afterwards from all the fossil fuel and the carbon dioxide we're putting out? And what about the methane that comes from natural gas? I mean, the industry has done a very good job of making the issue sound like, is the methane simply going to counterbalance the fossil fuel carbon dioxide? No, that's not the right issue. I mean, methane deep underground is not part of the methane cycle. That's part of global climate change. Once you're bringing methane to the surface, you're adding it to that global climate change process. You're adding it to the methane balance. It's your responsibility not to get below the amount of carbon dioxide, but to get it down as close to zero as you can. That's the right approach. We're not getting there. We're not thinking of this. We're not, again, putting this into a sustainability approach. Why is this difference there? The difference is there because there's all sorts of, why is the U.S. taking the lead on this and Europe not? I had the honor of spending 4 months in Germany at a University of Cologne, comparing the U.S. and the EU approaches to shale gas, and it boils down a lot to the property rights issue. In the U.S., property rights are very important to us. Not every, but most property owners in the U.S. own their subsurface property rights. That's true of almost no other place in the world. So if you're going to come in Europe to a place where there's shale gas, and there are places there, and say, oh, we want to drill here, and there's going to be noise, and there's going to be these dangers, and trucks running around 24 hours a day, what's in it for the local residents? What's in it for the property owner? Well, in the U.S., something's in it. And there's a fair amount of money that goes to these folks, and people vote that and work that. Reason we have that is because we have this within our Constitution, and our Constitution is something we revere. So we have a statement that property should not be taken. We put it on the level of life and liberty. Is that right in this current era of global climate change and the need to think of these things? Well, it's a major issue, and it's an issue that's growing more and more within the right wing of the Republican Party, more moved to the center to protect property rights against UN Agenda 21, against sustainable development. We have a paper in energy policy, which won't bother to go through, documenting this, if you will, anti-UN, anti-sustainability approach because of the protection of property rights against people who want to take it away from them for environmental purposes. Again, you can't ignore this. The issue of property rights in Europe is the issue of property rights in Europe just simply doesn't exist to the extent that it does in the United States. But the issue of wanting natural gas without drilling themselves does exist. And President Obama in Brussels in 2014 said he thinks it's useful to Europe to basically do their own on natural gas. He was asked, he came to Brussels to basically argue that Europe ought to be paying more for its defense, ought to be putting more money into NATO, and kept getting questions about natural gas. And he basically said, well, you folks got to develop your own natural gas. He ends by saying, the U.S. as a source of energy is one possibility. The Europeans had asked for the U.S. to send natural gas to Europe and promise it. He said, but we're also making choices and taking on some of the difficulties and challenges of energy development, and Europe is going to have to go through some of these same conversations as well. President Trump basically said the same type of thing, but in his own inimitable style. He put it in a little more strongly. But when he went out of the Paris Agreement, he puts in the statements that the same nations asking us to stay in the agreement are the countries that have collectively cost America trillions of dollars through tough trade practices, Europe, and in many cases lacks contributions to our critical military alliances. What the hell does NATO have to do with global climate change? But it's part of the process, it's part of the issue, and it's always going to be there. So let me finish with this picture of Germany, a very positive picture of the things that the Germans are doing, but use that to point out the cultural issues that are really central to how people are going to move forward with energy. This is the kind of thing that one sees routinely in pictures in driving through Germany. Fields of solar places, windmills. But you have to look very quickly if you want to see them. And the reason you have to look quickly is because you're driving at about 100 miles an hour. in something that the Germans claim costs 13% of their fuel for this, that there's a tremendous increase in carbon dioxide because of the fact that they can drive at any speed they want, and fast driving and stop and go that entails just is a loss. Germany strongly supports and has gotten more energy from these things, but at the same token, they stopped their nuclear approach after Fukushima. And as a result, they are now burning a rather poor grade of coal. And that coal is causing lots of pollution, lots of particulates, and adding to the carbon dioxide releases. But the cultural driving force is the driving. And just as we have a cultural driving force in the United States of sprawling and for the bad in terms of our environment, these things have to be taken into account when one looks at the different issues, rather than saying, well, that's simply wrong and we can't do it. You have to be able to work within the culture that must cut down on these energy sources. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein, for your presentation. And I give the floor to Margarita Reyes. I would like to remind you, please write your questions on the floors, on the sample that was given you, on the questionnaire. They will be collected by our interns, and they will be answered. We're trying to make sure that we have enough time for your questions at the end of the presentations. Mrs. Reyes.
Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, my name is Margarita Reyes. I work for the State Agency of Ukraine on Exclusion Zone Management. And I'm pleased to be here to shortly focus my presentation on the exclusion zone activities. Sorry for my voice, I'm just a little bit thick. So, as you may know, the exclusion zone is a huge territory contaminated with long-lived radionuclides as a result of the Chernobyl disaster. You may see some numbers just to remind you of the catastrophe of a planetary scale. Next slide, please. We often compare our exclusion zone to Luxembourg, of course, not by the territory it occupies, not by the welfare. Next slide, please. For those of you who may not be familiar with the functions of our agency, it is important to know that we have 4 core tasks, such as exclusion zone management, Chernobyl nuclear power plant decommissioning and transformation of the shelter object into an ecologically safe system, overcoming the consequences of Chernobyl disaster, and radioactive waste management all over Ukraine. Our activity is coordinated by the Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources of Ukraine, and it's important to mention that there is a number of enterprises under our management fulfilling its own functions regarding to the exclusion zone maintenance. Next slide, please. The key trends of the reforming of the exclusion zone led to its successful move from black point through the overcoming to development and so-called green point. They are engineering, construction, and science, which altogether provides for the positive changes. Next slide, please. In this regard, it's vital to provide open policy, create investment opportunities, and change the status of the exclusion zone to self-sustaining economic entity. Next slide, please. The main directions of practical exclusion zone transformation are as follows. First one is the creation of Chernobyl radiation and ecological biosphere reserve. Next one is solar energy development. My colleague will touch upon this issue in detail later. And infrastructure development. By infrastructure, I mean radioactive waste management facilities and others. Next slide, please. By the decree of the President of Ukraine, in order to preserve natural systems, provide territory remediation, and ensure the barrier function, the Chernobyl Biosphere Reserve was created, actually. Next slide, please. It's important to mention that the exclusion zone is open for visitors from 2010. Visiting the exclusion zone becomes very popular, and you can see the growth on this slide. Next slide, please. This is a short movie. Could you please push the button if possible under the picture? Okay, let's try. No? Okay, this is a short movie, but unfortunately it doesn't work. Actually, it's forbidden to touch animals in the exclusion zone, but this fox is a fox named Simeon. He is a symbol of the exclusion zone. He's very friendly. He eats food from your just hands, and yeah, animals in the exclusion zone are very lovely, and they are not afraid of people, even wolves. Next slide, please. Of course, there's no end to development of the exclusion zone, and we have an intention to just provide water tours in the near future, air tours and ecotourism for our visitors. And we welcome everyone in Chernobyl. Please come and see in your eyes the animals and nature and restoration. And our facilities, they are very huge and unique. Next slide, please. So to conclude my brief presentation, I'd like once more to stress out that there's been a long way to the exclusion zone transformation through the legislation, amendments, negotiations with stakeholders, mutual efforts with our international partners, and so on. And the exclusion zone is a really unique polygon for scientific research and international cooperation, and I'm sure that it has a bright future. So thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank Margarita Wright for her presentation, and Katerina Pavlova, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hello, dear colleagues and guests, and thank you, Dr. Dubrak, to invite us to this possibility to inform about situation about Chernobyl exclusion zone. I will try to be shortly, but with concrete points about solar park in Chernobyl. The implementation and realization of the solar energy development project is considered a new stage in the minimization of consequences that result from the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So, what we have for today? We have huge territories which forever withdraw from agricultural circulation. We also have very powerful electric power transport and network capacity, which is very important for investors to be sure that grid connection for future solar park it will be provided. Also, we have Paris Agreement regarding we should provide until 2020 11% of energy in Ukraine with alternative source. We also create territory by two parts. Please, next slide. How my colleague says, it will be a big reserve, natural reserve, and it will be 10-kilometer zone territory of special use, industrial use. And exactly on this territory will be the solar park. Our engineers and staff who work in Chernobyl NPP, they have found some special areas which are totally flat, especially for this big solar park. Next slide, please. The territory is located on the same latitude as Germany and France, which meets the energy needs from alternative source for more than 10 years. And our agency receive more than 60 applications for land lease Companies and potential investors are very interested about the zone, and we receive from France, Denmark, USA, China, Germany, and also from Belarus and Ukraine. The potential interest for electricity, it's up till 1.2 gigawatt. So this project are very, how to say, big one, and that's why this project go. Next slide, please. And cabinet minister control. And next one. Yes. On July 4, 2017, at the meeting of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, a decision was taken by the Minister of Energy and Coal Industry and Minister of Environment and State Agency of Ukraine on Exclusion Zone Management, with the participation of the state enterprise NEC Ukrenergo, to ensure the project development for the construction of infrastructure for collecting and issue power. Grid connection pre-feasibility study, and the development of infrastructure construction project, and the result was already present in December 2017. We also have big initiative from international experts. For example, company NG, French company, initiate a feasibility study on the solar energy project with funding from the government of France and close cooperation with Ministry of Environment and Natural Resource of Ukraine and State Agency of Ukraine on Exclusion Zone Management. The calculation of the feasibility study for the project was carried out. In March 2018, according to the result of the calculation of the feasibility study, the French company NG concludes that from a technical and economical point of view, the construction of the solar park with capacity of 1.2 gigawatt on exclusion zone is possible. So problems from faced by investors. One of the most important issue with the investor face building the alternative power object is the connection to the electricity networks. Second is the investors' concern about performance features on radioactively contaminated territories. And the solution we see is create state electric power transport enterprise on the basis with the involvement of high qualified staff from Chernobyl and PP who will be interested in building alternative energy objects. We have a lot of specialist engineers and other staff which can provide and service this project in future. Providing companies and investors with full range of service for construction and installation work, service of operating, maintenance, and other related service, meals, transport, accommodation. So this project is also one of the future issue and future decision for exclusion zone, and we hardly work to provide it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katerina, for your presentation, and I give the floor to Dr. Marta Inet. Push this.
Slides?
Well, it may be out of order because Andy Weber's next on the list.
Remind you now that we have most of you here. Oh, I would like to remind you now that we have most of you here. I think that there's another group that's we're waiting for. Please write your questions on the forms provided, and they will be collected. Dr. Elena?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Durbeck, for inviting me to this very interesting conference. I was asked to talk about preconception, prenatal, and childhood radiation exposure and cancer and other health risks. Next. So the goals of this presentation are to present the latest findings on the health effects of radiation exposure to children, drawing from the key studies, and to emphasize the state-of-the-art lifetime perspective on radiation-related health risks. And shown in the figure, as you can see, risk accumulates from very early in life, even we're going to talk about preconception a little bit later, all the way to older ages. And risk of radiation exposure accumulates through life. Of course, there is repair of damage, but risk continues to accumulate. And note that at the bottom of the slide, the genetic component is small. Next. So the topics I'm going to cover are the history and overview, a little bit of radiation and health. I realize this is a mixed audience, bringing you up to speed on what are the sources of radiation exposures, why study children, and then the bulk of the talk is going to focus on radiation-related cancer and other health risks by early time periods of exposure. Finally, I will talk briefly about some measures to reduce radiation exposure and then summarize. Next. So radiation was discovered more than 100 years ago with X-rays, and then a few years later, radon, and then applications of radionuclides to medical use a number of decades later. But soon after the discovery of radiation, the health effects, the serious health effects, became apparent. These are from very large doses of radiation, and shown on the slide are examples of very serious skin dermatitis and burns requiring amputation, other effects, cataracts, and the first cancer death was reported a few years later. Next. However, despite the fact that we've known about radiation and health effects for a long time, the first systematic studies of large populations were not carried out for about 50 years. And the main effects I'm going to talk about today are cancer, mental health problems, cataracts, and cardiovascular disease, with a major focus on cancer. Now, this is a talk about children, but the early health effects were first appreciated in workers, radiologists, radium dial painters, and then with the atomic bombs in Japan, major studies commenced. Next. So what are the major sources of radiation exposure? They fall into three categories. Medical sources, and those involve a variety of diagnostic X-ray, CT scans, and other kinds of procedures. Environmental, both natural background, such as radon, cosmic, and gamma, and then the man-made, nuclear power plants, weapons, etc. And then the third category, occupational, we're not going to talk too much about that today, but radiation workers, both nuclear and medical workers, and of course the military, exposed to fallout from above ground tests and other sources. Next. Now, how do we compare different types and sources of radiation in a way that's kind of meaningful? And what we have to use for this is a construct where we take the radiation, types of radiation, and we sum it across all the organs and tissues exposed so we can look at just the general levels. And the levels vary by orders of magnitude, as you can see. One transatlantic flight, a very tiny dose, and moving up to diagnostic X-rays, CT scans. I want to point out that radiation workers have an annual limit of exposure, much higher than traveling across the ocean. And then finally, we're into many orders of magnitude with the highest exposures to the atomic bomb survivors. Next. But these are not biologic effects. These are just an ability to be able to compare across different kinds of sources and populations. The biologic effects, in order to measure those, we need to understand doses to organs. And here I've shown some examples of doses to organs from various types of procedures. And again, these range by orders of magnitude, all the way from a single X-ray, for example, of the skull, moving up into higher doses, much higher, 20-fold to 40-fold higher, CT exams, and then Chernobyl, which has a very large range of doses. I will talk about that in a few minutes. And then, of course, radiation therapy to specific organs for treatment of cancer, etc. Next. Now, radiation exposure has changed dramatically over time worldwide. I show here an example from the United States, And you can see the two pie charts, one from 1980 and one from 2006. And the green is natural background radiation. We're all exposed to natural background radiation. There is no such thing as an unexposed person. But the natural background accounted for about 75% of the exposure in 1980. And due to the advent of medical forms of radiation, which have been clinically very helpful, I want to make sure that people understand that these have been very helpful. Now close to half of the source of radiation exposure to the population is from medical sources. And the largest source is from CT scans. In 2006, there were approximately 80 million in the United States. Other sources include nuclear medicine procedures, and then both radiography and interventional procedures. Next. So why study children? It's because children are the most sensitive to radiation. And here are 3 ages of children. And why are they sensitive? Well, the fetus is sensitive because of the very rapid organ and tissue development, also exposures of the mother, and ingestion and inhalation can have impacts on the fetus, also deficiencies such as folic acid and nutrients, etc. Why is the child sensitive? They have smaller body diameters and organ sizes than adults. They drink milk, which can be contaminated by fallout. And because of their behavior, crawling on the ground, putting items in their mouth, they can ingest radiation. Adolescents are sensitive because of puberty, with the growth spurts and some tissues undergoing increased proliferative activity, such as female breast, and hormonal changes. And then, of course, risk-taking behavior of adolescents. Next. So now the main emphasis of the talk is going to focus on 3 periods of radiation exposure. And each of these pictures will be illustrated by a brief description of individual important studies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about first the prenatal period, then the childhood period, and then preconception, the exposures to germ cells. Next. Now first I'm going to discuss the prenatal exposures. Now let me orient you. I realize this is a mixed audience, just orient you a little bit. So in epidemiology, we measure risk in different ways. One way is by comparing risk in exposed to risk in unexposed, and we use different measures to do that. And just to give you sort of a sense of what is a high risk, well, the risk for smoking and lung cancer is 10-fold increase. So now we're going to be talking about rather small exposures here, but this was a very striking first report that appeared in the 1950s. And remember, this is the pre-ultrasound days. So women and prenatal examination was carried out using x-rays called pelvimetry. And in an early sort of a shocking report from the United Kingdom, through a study done by a maternal interview, a very large study, about a 50% increase in risk was seen among the offspring of women who underwent pelvimetry compared to the offspring of women who didn't undergo pelvimetry for childhood leukemia. This study was greeted with a huge amount of skepticism, particularly in the US, and so Brian McMahon at Harvard carried out his own study where he wanted to have a more objective measure. Instead of maternal interview, he used medical records. And surprisingly, he found almost exactly the same result, about a 50% increase in risk among offspring of women who had undergone pelvimetry for childhood leukemia. Much more recently, a study was carried out in the United Kingdom, again using medical records, and by now, this is a mixture of offspring of women who had undergone pelvimetry and offspring of women who had undergone ultrasound. Ultrasound is non-ionizing radiation. In a number of studies that have been done, there is no evidence of risk. And while the risk is still increased, it's smaller, as you can see. Instead of a 50% increase, it's about 35% increased. And then finally, I'd like to point to a meta-analysis carried out in 2008 of 32 studies, and overall, the risk is about 30% increased for in utero radiation exposure from medical sources. And these are not high doses. I want to talk a little bit about the concern mostly in the general population is to what we call low-dose radiation. And it's, you know, it's not an arbitrary measure, but most people consider low dose to be about 100 milligray or below. So next was the study. This is a paradigm-changing study that was carried out of the in utero population exposed at the time of the atomic bombings. This was reported in 2008. And the reason this was such a paradigm-changing study was, before this study, it was thought that the fetus was more highly sensitive than young children. And what was found in this study, now we use a little bit of jargon in epidemiology, so I don't want you to get bogged down in excess relative risk versus relative risk. But the bottom line was that in utero exposure of children from the atomic bombings, this is risk per dose of radiation, increased about twofold for this is a very high dose of radiation, but basically risk increased about twofold. It says 1.0, but this is the excess over the relative risk. And in childhood, early childhood under age 6, it was a little bit higher. But what was really striking and surprising was risk when measured in cancers per 10,000 person years kind of percolated along following in utero exposure. This is up to 50 plus years after the atomic bombings. Whereas early childhood exposure, it was 7-fold higher number of cancers per 10,000 person years. So the findings overall showed a significant dose-related solid cancer increase following both periods of exposure, but the cancer risk per 10,000 person years following the in utero exposure was considerably lower than early childhood exposure. So we don't really know the reasons why. It may have to do with greater ability of the fetus to repair damage. Next slide. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the in utero studies of cancer risk following the radiation and the follow-up post-Chernobyl. And the question that was asked was, does exposure to I-131, this is a different kind of radiation than what we've been talking about before. Before we were talking about mostly external sources of radiation. But does exposure to I-131, that's the main radionuclide in fallout, among pregnant women increase thyroid cancer risk in their offspring? In this study, which followed up about 2,600 mother-child pairs in Ukraine, with a mean thyroid dose of 72. Remember, I mentioned that under 100 is considered low dose. Now, this is a very big range, and we're looking at dose response. So as you can see, the range of exposures in terms of milligray in this population ranged from 0 all the way to 3,200 milligray. It's a big range. But an excess risk was seen, about 12-fold increase, but because of the very small number of thyroid cancers, which is a rare condition, this was not, it did not attain statistical significance. This population continues to be followed up in Ukraine, and there's an in-process in utero cohort in Belarus, which is also being followed up. Next. Another population that was exposed in utero was in the southern Urals, and this is a population living in proximity to the Mayak nuclear refining, plutonium refining plant, where during the 50s and the 60s radionuclides were dumped into the nearby Techa River. And the question that was asked for this research was, does chronic ingestion of low-dose radionuclides by pregnant women increase the cancer risk in offspring? And in the study, 11,000 mother-child pairs were studied, and the doses overall, despite the fact that they continued to ingest this, were quite low, 11 milligray to soft tissue estimated, and the estimated dose to the red bone marrow, 84. And in this study, with a quite large follow-up, no excess was seen of solid or hematopoietic cancers with increasing in utero exposure. However, because the women and then their offspring continued to ingest the radionuclides from the river, risk rose with increasing postnatal exposures. So this echoes the findings from the atomic bomb survivors, where it looks like early childhood exposures may be more important. Next. Now I'd like to move a little bit on to childhood and adolescent radiation exposure. Next. Recently, a study was carried out, I mentioned before, of the big increase in CT scans, and this study looked at pediatric CT scans and cancer risks. And in this study, which was carried out of the United Kingdom, linking the radiologic exams with cancer registry data, a threefold increase was seen for leukemia and brain tumors with rather small doses of radiation from the CT scans. Now, CT scans are much higher dose than plain film X-rays, but nevertheless, this finding was really quite surprising. And you can see with the linear increase in risk with increasing dose, the dose is shown on the x-axis, and the relative risk is shown on the y-axis, with increasing red bone marrow dose on the left, and with increasing brain dose on the right, there's a linear increase in risk at these low doses. There's a number of studies underway in several parts of the world that are going to see whether these findings are replicated. But I think it's also important to point out that these scans have been really life-saving and life-changing. I mean, there's always a cost-benefit that needs to be taken into account. And when one looks at the absolute risk, that is, given 10,000 head CT scans, what is the risk? It's estimated to be one excess case per 10,000 head CT scans. Next. There's a condition of curvature of the spine that's seen primarily in young women, also seen in some young men. And this condition is monitored through multiple childhood and adolescent x-rays. If the curvature grows to be too great, rods are inserted into the spine because the curvature can lead to very serious problems with reducing lung function and cardiac and other problems. And in this study, which was carried out among a large number of young women who were followed up for many years, multiple doses of childhood and adolescent x-rays were with a higher dose to the breast, because it's the spine, but the breast is still exposed. Increasing risk of breast cancer was seen many years later with increasing dose. Next. Now, what about natural background radiation? And this may be a little bit more pertinent to the current situation in Chernobyl. Do we need to worry about natural background radiation? Well, the doses are extremely low. We're all exposed, so there is no escaping natural background radiation. But the question that was asked by the investigators is, if one has a large enough study, can one see any increase in risk with natural background radiation? So in the United Kingdom, an extremely large study was carried out. Just to give you a sense of how many cases occur in the US per year of childhood leukemia, there's about 3,200. So this is a study in the United Kingdom that went back for many, many years. The United Kingdom has about 80 million people, and the United States about 320 million, just order of difference in size. And what was found in this study was a small but measurable excess relative risk of childhood leukemia per millisievert of cumulative red bone marrow dose from gamma radiation. No excess was seen from radon, and radon is a very different kind of radiation exposure. It's not as penetrating as gamma radiation. No significant associations were seen for other childhood cancers, so this was unique to childhood leukemia. And this was one of the few studies that had reasonable statistical power to detect a predicted risk. An enlargement of this study is underway, going back even further in time, so we'll have a more precise measure of risk. But this is a significant increase in risk and something to think about. Next. Now, what about man-made radiation and childhood cancer? And in speaking to Andy Weber, the list shown on the left of the above-ground nuclear tests, some of these may be underground, but a large number of these have been above ground. And as you can see, during the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even into the 70s, in some places not shown here, above-ground tests were carried out. The main exposure is fallout from I-131. And in studies that have been carried out in terms of childhood cancer from these above-ground tests, acute effects have not been seen. And the main effects have been thyroid cancer and thyroid nodules because the main exposure is I-131, which heads to the thyroid gland. Now, there's a huge amount of concern worldwide about what about living near nuclear plants that have very low dose external radiation. And again, no acute effects have been seen. But in studies that have been done in proximity to about 200 nuclear plants, increased childhood leukemia was reported near 3 of them, no excess near 197 of them. But it's very difficult to study because leukemia is rare, the exposures are very low, and you would need huge populations to be able to study. But nevertheless, it looks as though for the majority of the plants, excess risks have not been seen. There's a lot of methodologic difficulties about carrying out these studies, and concern remains. The reason why the excess risks were seen around the 3 plants that have been reported, 2 in the UK, 1 in Germany, is not known. Next. Now, turning to the Chernobyl accident, where we've heard a lot this morning. This has been a sort of a landmark event, of course, but some very important science has come out of this. And the question that was asked around the time of the accident and how the studies were designed was to ask whether I-131, which is from fallout, is as carcinogenic as external radiation, and are patterns of risk the same. Next. So shown here are the results from follow-up of about 12 to 13,000 children in Ukraine and 12 to 1,000 in Belarus. And thyroid cancer is a very rare event, so the total number of thyroid cancers that was seen, these are children under age 19 who were exposed and have been carefully followed up. And the results are based on 65 thyroid cancer cases in Ukraine and 85 in Belarus. And as you can see, the increase in risk is observed in both of them, and it's very similar, about a 2-fold excess relative risk per gray. And one of the most interesting findings from this is that it appears as though earlier age at exposure age 0 to 4 is associated with a higher risk in both Belarus and Ukraine than at older ages. Now, these results were compared. Is this statistically significant? It is not, but in part it's because the numbers of the outcomes are very small. Next. So now turning to Fukushima, and I think that one of the most important developments that have come out of Chernobyl is the collaboration. The studies in Ukraine and Belarus and the main interest to try to provide data that is useful to all of us worldwide. I mean, this is just so important to all of us. And as a result of the work done in Chernobyl, a lot was learned that helped influence what went on following Fukushima. So shown to the left, a study was carried out and reported. A study was carried out almost immediately and for the next 3 years following the 2011 Fukushima accident. And essentially, 300,000 children underwent ultrasound examination. These were children under age 19. And 113 thyroid cancers were identified. And the investigators reported that this was substantially higher than the Japanese national rate. But a very large number of letters was written to the editor of the journal in which this study appeared, and a number of things was pointed out. First of all, when one does ultrasound examination, you increase your ability to detect clinically insignificant lesions that may have just gone away just by themselves. You know, repair occurs following radiation. So comparing screened populations, such as this population, with an unscreened Japanese national rate is very problematic, because what's reported to the Japanese registries is going to be clinically reported cancers. Another finding was there was no significant difference between the screened exposed by exposure level, and one would assume that if radiation was related to the risk, there would be a significant difference with those who had higher doses of radiation showing higher risks of thyroid cancer. This was not seen. The estimated thyroid doses were much lower than those associated with Chernobyl. And based on the findings from the studies in Chernobyl, the latency was way too short. In Chernobyl, the first thyroid cancers were not reported till 4 to 5 years later, and this is a survey done within 3 years. So overall, this study was quite problematic. Next. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about preconception radiation. So what do I mean by preconception radiation? And this is looking at effects in offspring of people who are exposed to radiation. So from studies that have been carried out in radiation workers, no excess has been seen in nuclear worker offspring or in medical worker offspring. Next. In terms of the A-bomb survivors, there's been a lot of follow-up study of the large population of offspring born to atomic bomb survivors, and these were children born, this is not in utero, this is children who were not exposed in utero, but were born to atomic bomb survivors and have been followed up through 2009. So the mean follow-up is 54 years. No excess cancer mortality risks have been seen. Next. And in populations that have received very high doses of radiation, childhood cancer survivors, no excess cancer has been reported to date in offspring of childhood cancer survivors, but the studies are not very large, and more rigorous studies are needed, so I think there's more work to be done here. Next. Now, briefly, radiation and outcomes other than cancer. Next. So one of the most important outcomes related to radiation are mental health outcomes. Mental health conditions have long been associated with disasters, not just radiation, but those involving radiation exposures. And what are some of these conditions? And they are shown here: anxiety, depression, fear, some somatic complaints, behavioral problems, and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And in well-done studies that have been carried out, the overall excess risk of these occurring is about 20% compared to unexposed populations after the first year. And those who seem to be more susceptible are females, and particularly mothers of young children, and those with prior psychological problems. And the first of these studies was carried out after 3 Mile Island and then after Chernobyl, and these have been very important studies that have pointed to something that really needs more attention. Next. And then briefly shown here are some other conditions that have been associated with radiation exposure. Non-malignant thyroid diseases has been, hypothyroidism has been found following fairly substantial doses of radiation, I-131 exposure in childhood in Ukraine and Belarus. And then a meta-analysis of adults has shown excesses of cardiovascular disease at low to moderate exposures, but there's been little research shown about long-term effects in children. And then the finding of cataracts, and these have been mostly reported in workers, also in other populations, atomic bomb survivors. But again, while growing evidence shows that low to moderate radiation levels are associated with increased risk, there's been no research on children. Next. Now, what measures can one take to reduce radiation exposure? Next. For diagnostic radiation, use something other than radiation for imaging, so ultrasound, MRIs. In addition, the community of physicians in many countries has been developing what they call appropriateness algorithms. Does every condition need radiation imaging? And in some cases, if it's done, how about what we call optimizing the strategy? So until about the year 2000, children were given the same radiation doses for many things than adults, and when it was pointed out that children are much smaller, their organs are smaller, the manufacturers moved into high gear to create software to optimize the doses to produce reasonable images, but at much lower doses. And this has been really one of the big breakthroughs in terms of using imaging exposures. In terms of therapeutic radiation exposures, use of blocking to block exposure from the radiotherapy to tissues that are not diseased, and newer radiotherapy modalities have been developed to reduce radiation scatter to the surrounding tissue, and then, of course, alternate treatments. What about radiation emergencies? So we haven't really talked much about the acute radiation syndrome, which may occur after substantial doses. And here, there are many measures, and you can find these on many websites, but the major procedures are first decontamination, and then treatment to mitigate respiratory or gastrointestinal absorption and primary toxicity. And then, of course, potassium iodide, if taken immediately, can reduce thyroid cancer risk. So in summary, I have described for you some of the radiation-exposed cancer and other outcomes following prenatal radiation exposures from diagnostic procedures, and those have been reduced. Pregnant women still do get x-rays following injuries and other events. Also, I've talked a little bit about the in utero A-bomb exposures that showed increasing risk with increasing exposure, but not really clinically seen for decades for solid cancers. We talked a little bit about childhood and adolescent radiation exposures, primarily. We talked a little bit about the patients with scoliosis, and then A-bomb exposures during particularly early childhood, and Chernobyl with the thyroid cancer. And then we talked about the absence of findings to date on preconception radiation exposures for offspring of radiation workers, A-bomb survivors, and childhood cancer survivors. Next. So if you have any questions that we don't have time to get to today, are the email addresses listed on the...
Well, first, let me thank you for your presentation. I also, and before I give the floor to our keynote speaker, I would like to mention to you that for all of you that are here coming late, that this conference is a webcast. It is also, all the presentations are published in the World Ecology Report, which will be coming out in June. So you can get it online, and if Dr. Lynette wants to give you her personal number, you can ask her for it. So our keynote speaker is Honorary Andy Weber. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Durbak, and Ambassador Yelchenko, our Ukrainian colleagues, Dyakyu. It's a real honor to be here today, especially among so many emerging leaders. So I'm going to share a few of my experiences, talk a little bit about recent history and the continuing threats of nuclear weapons and nuclear terrorism. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and it turned everything upside down. The day before this happened, we were concerned about a strong adversary, the Soviet Union. And if we could go back to my first slide, please. And then, after the coup against Gorbachev, where he lost command and control of nuclear weapons, we became concerned about the weakness, the chaos in the aftermath, that this enormous legacy of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, that the materials, the weapons themselves, the experts would proliferate and spread and perhaps be exploited by even small terrorist groups. So two visionary American senators, Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, launched a program in 1991 called the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program that was led by the United States Pentagon, Department of Defense, and I had the opportunity of spending much of my 30-year career in government working on the program that they created. They had a vision that enabled Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus within years after the collapse to be free of nuclear weapons, and assisted with that very historic effort. And during the course of my career, we've made a lot of progress on countering weapons of mass destruction, be they nuclear, chemical, or biological. We used to talk about 5 rogue states that had weapons of mass destruction programs, and one by one, through international efforts, we've denuded these countries of weapons of mass destruction. Iraq was successfully denuded of weapons of mass destruction in the first Gulf War, and with UN efforts in the aftermath of that in the 1990s, the mid-1990s. Libya no longer has weapons of mass destruction. That was an effort that was launched in 2003 and took over 10 years to accomplish, but successful. And today, with the chaos in Libya, we're happy that there are no weapons of mass destruction available there. Syria, an amazing international effort that I had the honor to participate in, successfully removed and destroyed 1,300 tons of chemical weapons from Syria. Sarin, VX, very dangerous nerve agents. And Iran, with the nuclear agreement, is prevented from attaining nuclear weapons. That's a great achievement. And the news today from the Korean Peninsula is extraordinary, because North Korea is the last of the remaining 5 so-called rogue states that has nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, the largest chemical weapons deployed arsenal in the world, and biological weapons. So we can hope that we'll make progress in the near term to reduce that enormous remaining threat of state WMD programs. But in the last 12 months, just in the last 12 months, North Korea used a chemical weapon, a nerve agent, VX, in an assassination in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Recently in Salisbury, England, the Russian government operatives used a very advanced 4th-generation chemical weapon called the Novichok agents in that assassination, that bungled, failed assassination attempt. And we've seen repeated use as in Syria, as President Bashar al-Assad commits crimes against humanity with chemical weapons, including sarin gas. So there's much more that needs to be done. And in terms of actual nuclear weapons, we've made progress. There used to be 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, many of them 10 or even 100 times larger than the 2 that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 to end World War II. There are nearly 15,000 nuclear weapons today, and some of you younger people in the audience maybe thought that nuclear weapons as a problem went away with the Cold War, but unfortunately, this challenge remains. Next slide, please. When I was, so nuclear weapons, there are 2 paths to nuclear weapons. You need either highly enriched uranium or plutonium for a nuclear weapon. And there are two ways that you can attain those bomb materials. One is through theft or diversion from state programs that have these materials, and the other is by having a legitimate peaceful use of nuclear power program, but then covertly pursuing military applications. And that's where the IAEA, the UN International Atomic Energy Agency, plays a very important role in overseeing the peaceful use of nuclear energy to make sure that it's not diverted for nuclear weapons purposes. And they're on the ground in Iran ensuring that our agreement is implemented with full verification. So we've made a lot of progress on reducing the supply of nuclear weapons materials around the world. in the last 25 years, the number of countries that have bomb quantities of highly enriched uranium and plutonium has been reduced by more than half, from over 50 countries to less than 25 countries today, and that has been an international effort. President Obama launched the nuclear security summits that accelerated that work. But his vision in the Prague speech of a world without nuclear weapons, we've made much less progress on arms control and disarmament. Next slide, please. As a young man, a young United States diplomat, I remember in 1992 reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about the opening of our new embassy in a country called Kazakhstan. It said, the headline read, U.S. Embassy Almaty, looking for diplomats who find Paris a bore. And I thought, that's me. So I volunteered. I spent 10 months learning the Russian language, and in the summer of 1993, I arrived in Almaty, Kazakhstan, as an eager young diplomat. And within the first month of my arrival, I was approached by an automobile mechanic who asked me if I wanted to buy some uranium. And I was, of course, very skeptical, but you need to follow up these things. And I said, well, maybe I'm interested. And this led to a series of events where I was introduced to the director of a factory in eastern Kazakhstan at a place called Ust-Kamenogorsk, Askamen. His name was Vitaly Mete. And over a period of months, I gained his trust. And he told me that in his factory, there were 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that had been left over from a secret Soviet naval reactor, submarine reactor program. And with the approval of President Nazarbayev, I was invited to visit the factory. And here you see pictures of the material, this metal bucket filled with highly enriched uranium rods that are directly usable in nuclear weapons. There was enough material there for dozens of nuclear bombs. And it was protected by a good padlock. Next slide, please. So we launched a secret project together with the government of Kazakhstan to secure and remove this bomb material so it wouldn't be available to Al-Qaeda, or at that time Iranian agents were scouring the former Soviet Union for weapons of mass destruction, expertise, materials, and weapons. And you see here a convoy of trucks carrying safely packaged for transport this 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium to an airfield in Ust-Kamenogorsk. And in this, I remember like it was yesterday, driving from the factory at 3 o'clock in the morning in this convoy. There was black ice on the roads, the trucks were sliding, and I didn't want to have to report to Washington that one of them slid off a bridge and was now floating down the Irtysh River. Thankfully, we made it to the airport, and in the longest military transport flight, nonstop flight in history, that material was flown to the United States, where it was sent to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and blended down for use in nuclear power reactors. And that project took this material off the market. It was followed up by many similar efforts that reduced the number of countries that have these materials. It was described in a book by David Hoffman called The Dead Hand, and Cary Grant is now producing a movie about this Project Sapphire. Cary. Next slide, please. This is the Semipalatinsk nuclear weapons test site where the Soviet Union conducted 456 nuclear weapons tests, and over 150 of those were atmospheric or above ground tests. And the human toll on the surrounding populations was devastating. I've become friends with an artist who now paints anti-nuclear paintings. He has no arms and legs because as a baby he was exposed to the fallout from these nuclear weapons tests. The area of this test site was as large as Belgium, and within it there's an exclusion zone of 300 square kilometers that can never be used. But we worked secretly with our Russian counterparts and Kazakhstani counterparts to secure several hundred kilograms of plutonium that were left over at this test site. That project took 17 years to complete and was announced in Seoul by Presidents Medvedev, Obama, and Nazarbayev in 2012 at the Nuclear Security Summit. There are two very dangerous trends now happening in the world related to nuclear weapons. The first is that the risk of nuclear war is the highest it has been in my lifetime. Indeed, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has moved the so-called doomsday clock to just 2 minutes before midnight, which is the closest to midnight it has been since 1953. And one of the driving forces for this increased risk of nuclear war is the blurring of the line between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. Both Russia and the United States are pursuing smaller, more usable nuclear weapons for nuclear warfighting in a limited regional conflict. And anybody who's ever been to Chernobyl or Fukushima, as I have, knows that, and the releases of radiation there were much smaller than even a small nuclear weapon. The devastation that would happen in even a small nuclear war and the risk that it would escalate to a planet-ending conflict, nuclear exchange, is too high. So we need to work against this trend of sort of the 1960s idea that you could have small battlefield nuclear weapons. And the other related negative trend is that with the breakdown of the arms control treaties, such as the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated in 1987, and now the New START Treaty between Russia and the United States, it expires in 2021 and it needs to be extended. But for the first time in 40 years, Russians and Americans are not negotiating a follow-on nuclear arms control agreement. So we're at the beginning of an unconstrained arms race, and we've been there before, and we shouldn't go there. It will be costly. The United States plans to spend over the next 30 years on nuclear weapons modernization, including Donald Trump's 3 new lower yield nuclear weapons that were announced earlier this year, $1.7 trillion. 1.7, that's $1,700 billion on nuclear weapons modernization. And the same in Russia. President Putin's announcement in his speech to the Russian Federation earlier this year described more new nuclear weapons, including nuclear cruise missiles. And they're the most dangerous and destabilizing class of nuclear weapons because you can't tell if it's carrying a conventional weapon or a nuclear weapon. There's no way to discriminate. So I've been working with governments in Europe and Asia to eliminate this dangerous class of nuclear weapons, nuclear-armed cruise missiles. Next slide, please. So my message to you, it's really a request to the emerging leaders in the room. As I described, these threats of weapons of mass destruction are still with us. They're growing, and indeed, the very survival of the planet is at stake. And so I had the privilege in my public service career of 30 years of working on trying to reduce these threats. And we made some progress, but much more progress needs to be made. And as you embark on your professional careers, whether you pursue science or journalism or public and global service, I would ask that you work on these issues, because it's individuals like you that will be the heroes in making the world a safer, healthier, and better place for our children and their children. So thank you for your leadership.
I would like to thank Mr. Weber for his presentation and give the floor to Dr. Peter Salk.
Dr. Durback, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have been invited to take part in this conference. And Mr. Weber, thank you for that presentation, which in a way is a call to action on our part, that we need to come to our senses. And I think we need to be aware of the environment in which we're sitting right now. We'll stay on that first slide. We're sitting in this United Nations, which was created to help us guide our path through the world in a way that will allow us all to relate to each other constructively and creatively, rather than to pursue the destructive paths that led to the creation of this organization following the two world wars. 3 years ago, the United Nations created an agenda, a 15-year agenda, that had to do with what's been called sustainable development. Looking around at the world, we see so clearly the problems that confront us in terms of the environment, in terms of war, in terms of violence of all sorts, the loss of the life in the oceans, the degradations around us in so many ways, the inhumanity that we face in our relations with each other, and the inequalities that exist on the planet. And the UN established 17 goals for sustainable development, which include eliminating poverty, eliminating hunger, good health and well-being for everyone, quality education, equality amongst between the genders, clean water and sanitation, the goal that we're dealing with here today having to do with affordable and clean energy, work, environment, economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure, reducing inequalities of all sorts, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, action involving climate change, our dealings with life below the water and life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and the partnerships that are necessary in order to achieve these goals. There's so much that needs to be done in terms of creating a path for ourselves ahead, and we tend to think in terms of the objectives. What are we dealing with? What are the projects? What are the tasks that are in front of us? And what I want to do today is to focus on another dimension, another element, which is the human dimension. All of the things that we deal with in the world today have to do with us as people, and our ability to achieve these noble goals depends on our ability to interact creatively and constructively with each other. So that's the focus that I'm going to take, is on that dimension of the situation. If we go to the next slide. My father, Jonas Salk, was known for his contributions in the field of health. In the middle of the 1950s, he and his research team at the University of Pittsburgh created the first vaccine against polio, a devastating disease which crippled children, adults, and affected each year over 500,000 people in the world. Polio is today, as a result of that vaccine and a second one that was developed, almost gone. Less than 100 cases of polio caused by circulating polioviruses in the world. So we're on the brink of success, but even there, we're being hampered by the fact that we can't get vaccine to people, to children in all countries because of strife, as in Syria. Because of political, cultural, religious differences, we still have those limitations that are hampering the success of this, what would seem to be otherwise a straightforward public health effort. What my father is not so well known for was his interest in humanity and its future. He wrote 4 books. I'll just cite 2 of the titles. One was called Survival of the Wisest, which is a play on the words that are attributed to Charles Darwin and his concept of survival of the fittest. Another book was written with my youngest brother Jonathan called World Population and Human Values, A New Reality. And what I want to do to start with is to look at some of the thinking that my father proposed and put forth in his writings, in his talkings, that give a perspective on our situation as a species. He tended to look at things and think about things from an evolutionary perspective. So that's the first issue that I want to share. So let's go on to the next slide. We tend to think of evolution as Darwinian in terms of biological evolution, the evolution of one species to another. But I want to put it in the larger perspective that my father described. He looked at evolutionary progress over time, starting from the first appearance in the world of fundamental particles and atoms and molecules, their coalescence into stars and galaxies and planets. This was a phase of pre-biologic evolution. This is before considering anything having to do with life, but the universe was evolving. And I should say that I'm giving a scientific perspective. One could think of things in religious terms. I think that these are very compatible in many different ways, but I'm just going to use the language that I'm familiar with. So the second phase of evolution is the biologic phase that we tend to think about ordinarily, which has to do with the appearance of living organisms, individual cells, multicellular organisms, and then ultimately, from our personal perspective, the appearance of humans on the scene. So that's the next stage of evolution, which is what we usually think about. But we're in a different phase of evolution right now. Humanity has dominated the planet. And we're in a phase that my father considered to be meta-biologic evolution, which has to do not with evolving different physical characteristics, the number of fingers and so on and so forth. It has to do with the evolution of our minds, of our cultures, of our society, of the products of our thinking. We look at the world around us, and this is what dominates our situation today, and that's where the evolutionary issues are taking place. In the next slide, I want to put the population issue into perspective. That was mentioned earlier in the conversations today. If we look at world population growth through history, it's rather remarkable. For millions of years, the population of human population was relatively, excuse me, relatively stable, and over the last numbers of millennia. And only in the last 200 to 300 years has the population shot up in the way that it has of late because of our increased ability to master the issues in our environment with the industrial revolution, the scientific revolution, the agricultural revolution. Look what has happened to the population on our planet. And if we go to the next slide, we'll continue this perspective. Where do we go from here? The first line, which is the dotted line A, just shows what has been happening, unlimited exponential growth, but it's clear that cannot persist. We live on a finite planet. There is only so much room for people. There's only so many resources. That is an impossible trajectory. Another trajectory would be the one that's labeled C, which you see in nature. If a species such as deer outgrow their environment and overgraze, the population can crash. It's certainly within the possibility for humanity that we misuse our resources and we get to a tipping point where we can no longer survive, or as a result of misbehaviors, nuclear war, etc. That's a possible outcome, but it's one that certainly, from at least my perspective, does not seem to be a desirable one. Much more desirable is the curve labeled B, which shows the population growth slowing, still increasing, but the rate going from an upturning rate where it's continually increasing to one where the growth is beginning to slow and plateau. That, if we are to be successful in moving into the future, as we look back, that should be the curve that we will have followed. So we'll go to the next slide, which shows my father's conceptualization of this kind of an S-shaped curve, which you see in nature very frequently in many different settings. And what he recognized was that there are two different epochs to this curve. The first epoch, which he called Epoch A, had to do with this continually increasing rate of growth. And I should say on a personal note that when these ideas were first put forth, we were still solidly in this phase. So I was born into an epoch where the sky was the limit. It may not have been that way everywhere in the world, but it was certainly my own personal experience. And he saw that there was a second phase of this potential outcome of Epoch B, where the growth will begin to slow and plateau. And what he recognized was that there are two different realities here. The reality that someone of my age may have been born into in Epoch A, and a separate, different reality in Epoch B. We're facing different issues. People who are being born now are being born in a different reality on this planet. We'll go to the next slide and look at I'll skip going over the first few items here, but some of the differences between the human values, attitudes, and behaviors that are appropriate for, in a sense, those two different epochs. In Epoch A, we'll go partway down the list, this was a time in which we were focused as a species on overcoming external restraints. We wanted to grow. Growth was the predominant driving factor. Whereas in Epoch B, where we find ourselves now, our task is to impose self-restraints. The sky is not the limit. We have to recognize that. We have to take control of ourselves. In Epoch A, competition was the driving force. Who wins? Who creates the more for themselves? This was what drove progress, so to speak. Now, in this epoch, what's much more important is cooperation. We have to begin to work together. In Epoch A, the dominant driving force, in a sense, was selfism. Myself, my family, my community, my country. It was this orientation towards that's centered around one's own self, whereas if we're going to survive in this age, what is going to be the most important to emphasize will be mutualism. We have to see how we can approach, rather than win-lose attitudes, a win-win attitude where everyone gains from the outcomes that we want to see take place, and to move from a state of mind which is limited in scope, narrow thinking, to one which is broader, seeing a universal context in which our own actions are taking place, and where the focus goes from one of being short-sighted, thinking only in terms of the short-term outcomes, to one of long-range thinking. So this is a transition that we need to make. All of these different attributes are natural for the human being. They're all part of our genetics, to be selfish, to be generous, but the emphasis needs to change as we make the transition to this new aspect of our reality. Where do we have to turn attention if we're going to be able to help make this transition successfully? We'll go to the next slide, and that has to do with ourselves, our consciousness. That's where the important change resides, where we have to make the advances if we're going to succeed. We look around us in the world, we read the newspapers, and we see consciousness being disordered, consciousness being narrow. We all know what it's like not to get a good night's sleep, and you wake up in the morning and things are bleary, and it's hard to make decisions. And what ends up happening when consciousness is not functioning clearly, that all these little lines that you see towards the bottom of the slide, different individual tendencies, things that we want to see happen in the world, and different people's desires and so on, and you end up with a disordered consciousness, with these things being thrown together. Confligo is the Latin, throwing together, and you end up with conflicts. What we'd much rather see, what I would much rather see, is clear consciousness. We wake up feeling good and clear in the morning, and whatever we can do to help clarify our consciousness, create the kind of a broader comprehension and broader understanding, then these individual tendencies, rather than being thrown together in conflicts, will flow together, and there'll be conflux rather than conflicts. Okay, I want to go to the next slide and just go back to this perspective that my father had put together, and there's an arrow that's been added, which is my own way of thinking of where do we need to look for a solution to the kinds of changes that we need to make. Of course, there's all these things that need to be done on the outside and the different actions that need to be taken, but that arrow goes back to the beginning. It goes back again, I'll take it from a scientific point of view, back to before the Big Bang, before everything in existence emerged and has continued to evolve in the way that it has. Where did this all come from? What existed before the universe emerged? And another question, which is, where does our consciousness come from? We're sitting here, we're sentient, we're hearing, we're thinking, we are aware. Where did this come from? If we look at a universe in which we have particles and electrons and neutrons floating around and doing things and bumping into each other, why would we think, in a sense, that there would be any subjectivity involved? So where that arrow is pointing, it's just pointing to the concept that there is some universal aspect of existence which is at the basis of all of nature. It's at the basis of everything that's taking place in this whole scheme of universal evolution. It is where our consciousness resides, and if the more that we can learn about and take advantage of, oh boy, only 1 minute, I'm so sorry, then I will go very quickly. We need to take advantage of that. Okay, next slide, just showing an approach that's being taken. I'll shortcut this. There are many approaches to human development. The idea that meditation as a concept is a way that one might be able to draw on these deeper aspects of our own existence and make use of it not only for ourselves but also for society, and the concept that groups being brought together with people practicing these techniques can have an influence that spreads at this deepest level of nature and can have a positive effect. The next slide, there have been some studies undertaken looking at the influence of these kinds of groups practicing meditation techniques on, in this case it was the civil war in Lebanon in the mid-1980s, and there were 3 groups that were brought together during that period, and in each case this is a war peace index. Peace is in the upward direction, war is in the downward direction, and coinciding with these 3 different groups, some at great distance from Lebanon, there was an improvement in the war that was ongoing at that point. The next slide, looking at 7 such groups during a 2.5-year period during that war, and in each case, you saw that in comparison to the 10%, the 90% of the time when nothing was taking place, and then these 7 different interventions covering about 10% of the time, a reduction in the conflict in the war in Lebanon, and a reduction in war fatalities. You cannot get a more solid, hard statistic than that, a 71% reduction in fatalities in Lebanon by group, in association with groups brought together as far away as Iowa, Washington, the Netherlands, etc. So what's going on? I think there's something that needs to be looked at. The next slide is just recognizing the relationship with Ukraine. At this meeting, I just wanted to point out that there was a summit held in Kiev not quite a year ago, that was the Global Union of Scientists for Peace, looking at some of these questions and technologies. In the next slide, in Ukraine, looking at meditation as a way of intervening for soldiers with post-traumatic stress syndrome, quieting their minds, having good effects, and with the concept that with these kinds of programs being introduced, there may be effects on increasing peace in the environment. The next slide is President Poroshenko of Ukraine meeting with David Lynch, a famous American film director who is helping to fund programs of this type. So the next to last slide, we're faced with opportunities to use technologies of all sorts to improve our lives, in addition to the outside technologies, external technologies. It's worth, it seems to me, including these subjective, these internal technologies. And as the President of the General Assembly said in a conference over these last 3 days, having to do with building and sustaining peace, there's a toolbox that we have at our disposal. I think that it would be worthwhile adding these kinds of techniques to that toolbox. And the last slide, my father, when he received the Jawaharlal Nehru Award for International Understanding in 1977, his acceptance address was titled with a question: are we being good ancestors? I think I would like to see us take the kinds of actions that would allow our children and our children's children to look back upon us and answer that question, yes. Thank you.
And I would like to thank Dr. Salk, and I give the floor now to Gilad Regev.
Thank you very much. I think that will help. Thank you very much, Dr. Durbach, Your Excellency, for inviting me to speak here in front of you today. I agree with Dr. Goldstein that sustainability is a process, but as an impatient entrepreneur, I decided that that process should be accelerated. Next slide, please. So we all know the very important decision that took place in Paris. Just I want to remind ourselves that it took over 2 decades to reach such a global target. Next slide, please. A reality check provides that not only we are on the target of reaching this goal, but going the other direction. What you see here is a very important indicator of parts per million, that is CO2, that should be reduced to 350 globally, but actually continue rising into frightening heights. Next slide, please. As we can see, oil and products consumption is continued to rise, and according to International Energy Agency, there is a prediction that it will start to decline only 22 years from now, that is 2040. Next slide, please. Astonishingly, according to Bloomberg, investment in renewables actually are on a decline globally. In 2016, there were a decline of 23% of investment in renewables, and 2017 was not really much better. Ironically, the reason for this decline is that renewables became very efficient, so innovation really worked, and as a result of that, governments simply stopped to support them, and we can see the sad reality. Next slide, please. These are the numbers that IMF is predicting, which are direct result of climate change. We're talking about 3 million deaths per year, which are directly result of climate change. And in the short course of my talk, there will be losses of more than $100 billion as a result of that. Next slide, please. So we can see that innovation and technologies are not really working. We are innovating, and then we are abandoning the technologies that we are developing. And I don't suggest that we should stop to develop technologies, but what really we should pay attention, and history provide that, is that rewarding behavior giving better results than punishment. And an excellent example are the carbon credits that really didn't work, because polluting countries and entities simply paying out and continue to pollute. And what we really need is to recreate a system that will reward a sustainable behavior. A system that is not dependent on regulations, as they are too volatile and slow. It does not depend on Wall Street, as it only interested in a bottom line. We really need a simple system that can be trusted by the mass, as they are interested in sustaining their bills and not sustaining the world. Next slide, please. So what we are doing, we are creating a new global sustainable bank, Moneta Bank, and our mission is to stimulate a massive acceleration of sustainable behavior by simply rewarding it with a dedicated currency. We call it the euro. We turn renewable energy into money. The way I see it, that's actually energy preservation. And this mission will succeed only if we can build that trust in this currency, and all of us will be dedicated. I want to emphasize, I really wish to emphasize, that we are not a feel-good movement that calling to go and hug trees. I like to hug trees, but that's not the purpose. We are not sophisticated technology only for geeks, techies, nor we are trying to create any system that will make anyone rich overnight. We are developing a monetary reward system that fits everyone, and even my mother, who she is 20, she's not 20, she is 85 years old. Well, that was in purpose. I wanted to see that you're awake. Even she understands that, and she doesn't have to break her savings or become a rocket science engineer in order to use the system. Next one, please. So how we are going to do it? Very, very simple. We are simply going to issue euros to anyone that's producing renewable energy. And I want to emphasize, we are not going to buy the energy. Producers of renewable energy can still use it for their own benefits, sell it to their neighbors, or sell it to the grid. We are simply going to reward them with issuing this currency according to the size of the production and according to locations. Next slide, please. To those of you who do not know, there are between 1.5 and 2 billion people that living in what is called energy poverty. So what Moneta Bank is planning to do, we're going to pay 3 times more for production of renewable energy in this region. We're actually going massively to change the real estate of energy. Next slide, please. At the next stages, we will cover other major sustainability requirements, such as transportation, food, and recycling. For example, we will pay for everyone that walks using the bicycle or using a public transportation. Next slide, please. This ambition vision requires certainly policy guidelines, and really it's important to emphasize that everyone has to be included, and the euro, the currency, has to be trusted. And the last slide, please. My name is Gilad Regev. I'm a father to 4. I'm a worried father to 4. I'm an entrepreneur and an investment banker. And I was dreaming and developing this vision for over 5 years. And now with my team, with my colleagues, we started working to make it into a reality, and you're all welcome to join. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gelev, and I give the floor to Cooperative Group. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and most of all, fellow students. We have heard some brilliant insights from the faculty today on the various efforts being undertaken to transition our world from a carbon-intensive energy sector to a greener, more sustainable future. However, let there be no doubt, our voyage to such a future has only just begun, and our generation will inherit a colossal crisis. Globally, around 1.1 billion people do not have access to electricity, And while progress has been made in Asia, particularly India, about 240 million people in the country continue to live in the dark, quite figuratively. 1/3 of the world's population, that's 2.5 billion people, rely on the traditional use of solid biomass to cook their meals. And even by the most optimistic estimates, the Paris Agreement to curb CO2 emissions is a challenge, to say the least. But the future I'm looking forward to is one that is being silently fought by the many inspiring young men and women working in their communities to increase energy efficiency and make the future more palatable. A young man like a 15-year-old Kevin Doe from Sierra Leone, who taught himself engineering by collecting scraps and garbage, and by the age of 13, invented batteries to power lights in nearby homes using scrap metal. A young social entrepreneur like Siddharth Malik from New Delhi, who left an illustrious career in the United States to start a renewable energy venture in India that amalgamates solar thermal systems with fossil fuels, guided by his personal philosophy: at least when the sun is shining, fossils need not be fired. Or even Terry Gonzalez Garcia, a young woman from Mexico who has started a global movement to repurpose plastic soda bottles to create sustainable light sources called Liter of Light, and has become a global icon for ecological and low-cost lighting solutions for underprivileged communities around the world. We have gathered here today in Resolute, determined to find solutions and remedies for global environmental challenges. But I request, let our voice not only reach world leaders from the United Nations today, but rather future leaders. We must be in service of their fight, in the fight of the many other unsung heroes around the world who have fused their compassion and knowledge in ways that better the health of their communities and the earth. Yet, young people remain burdened by the wheels of inaction, fighting an uphill battle for quality education and decent employment, facing restrictive legal policies and becoming entrepreneurial, and remaining marginalized from capital flows and financial incentives. We have gathered here today to discuss energy crisis. But Dr. Durbach, I want to invert that, and I want to say that in this crisis, there is energy, there is passion, there is unwavering commitment by young people. And we must ensure that this energy is allowed to grow and innovative solutions for the future can become a possibility. The voice of young people is unanimous. We are a generation that does not play the blame game. We are a generation whose conviction is not curbed by political incorrectness. We are a generation whose passion is not dwindled by bureaucracy. We are a generation whose courage is not weakened by inaction. And we are a generation whose resolve is not wavered by apathy. This is the future we are looking forward to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta, for a very inspiring conclusion statement. And now we are moving to questions, and those of you who have submitted questions, some of them will be answered for the time that we have. The first, Your Excellency.
Thank you. Well, before I will answer the only question which was addressed to me, I would like to appreciate once again the audience, because I must tell you that I'm chairing many meetings in this organization or just participating, and such an audience you can see only when they discuss issues like North Korea, which was mentioned, only the burning issues, which means that this is really a very important opportunity. Thank you, organizers and panelists, for doing this. The question addressed to me was about the Ukraine energy needs and what steps is Ukraine taking to improve energy efficiency. Although it's not my favorite topic, I'm not an expert, of course, in energy, but what I can tell you is that this is correct. Ukraine's industry is among the least energy efficient in the world. And our industry consumes almost 45% of the country's total energy, which is a disastrous figure. to help improve it, for example, the World Bank has provided almost $200 million to Ukraine just recently. But this is only the part of the problem, because the other part of the problem is the households in Ukraine, as 60% of our population lives in urban areas, and our major cities inherited very outdated, aging heating infrastructure from the Soviet times. And not only heating infrastructure, for example, the supply of hot water. I will tell you, just yesterday I read the news that in my native city, capital of Ukraine, in Kiev, the mayor decided to switch off the hot water supply until the 1st of June, and we're still not in the, not even in the, at the beginning of summertime, which means that almost 3 million people, 80% of Kyiv population, will stay without hot water. Why? Because the supply system is so old, you cannot just use it for the whole year, and after every winter it needs some refurbishment. Just to give you another example, in New York, in Manhattan, I pay in wintertime for the heating in my apartment something, well, between $100 and $125 per month. In Kyiv, where I don't live right now, and I don't use my apartment, I pay up to $250 per month, because I cannot switch it off. It's just running. The energy is wasted. So this is the example, and I'm talking about the capital city of the country. There are many reasons for that. You cannot really refer all the problems to the Soviet time and the lack of sophisticated equipment. I think that the main reason is that for almost 25 years we were relying on the very cheap Russian gas supply. The cost of the gas, which is the main source for heating and hot water and other things, the price was so low, so I used to pay 25 years ago about $10 per month. So just to show you the difference. But even when the conflict or the Russian aggression against Ukraine has started 4 years ago, we were still receiving the gas supplies from Russia. The price, of course, was much higher, but still, I think it's not the market price, it's lower, and that caused the problems because people just never got used to the, or even started to think that they should take care of their own pockets and not wasting money for overpaying for gas supplies. And industry, as I said at the beginning, is consuming even more. So my answer to this question is, well, everything takes time. I think that we're now in the middle of the road. I think the improvements will come, but it will still take I would say many years to create the real supply system in Ukraine and the system which will be energy efficient. Thank you.
Thank you, and Excellency, Mrs. Komita.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach. My question must be from someone from Pennsylvania. Pipelines transporting natural gas continue to be built, yet there are many problems with them, such as forced taking of land, eminent domain, significant leakage of methane, which contributes to climate change, and the construction of polluting compressors to push the gas through the pipeline. What are your thoughts about pipelines? Well, my thought is that, number one, we need to do everything we can to transition to 100% renewable energy, clean energy as soon as possible, so there is not a need for pipelines. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what side of the issue you sit on, Pennsylvania sits on the world's fourth largest deposit of natural gas, the Marcellus Shale deposit. We were not aware that this shale deposit even existed about 10 years ago. In my district, it's all pipelines all the time. I wish that it were not. I wish we were talking about other sustainable behaviors, but my job is to do everything I can to make sure that any pipeline that is built in Pennsylvania, certainly in my district, is the absolute safest pipeline on the planet, and that then we push to renewable clean energy as quickly as possible. Dr. Goldstein has been very helpful, and he said, Carolyn, the pipelines are going to be built. He said, you need to make sure that you keep up the pressure, the people keep up the pressure, that you vote for people who care about people over profits, that care about protecting the environment and the people that live there. So that is what I am doing, and also working to move us to 100% clean energy as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Comita. Mr. Weber.
I want to thank you for these great questions. Some really hard ones, but too many of them. So I'll take them home with me. And if you want to engage with me, I'm at Andy Weber NCB is my Twitter handle, and you can send me a direct message if you want to follow up. Question about nuclear weapons testing in India and Pakistan. We have a very important opportunity. 20 years ago, many countries negotiated a comprehensive test ban treaty that ended nuclear weapons testing. But it's not yet in force because countries like China, Egypt, the United States have not ratified it. So we need to bring this treaty into force. I hope that North Korea, as part of this current summitry, will join the comprehensive test ban treaty, and that India and Pakistan, which have not tested since 1998, will maintain their moratorium as the United States, China, Russia, and other countries have since the early 1990s. But we're at risk. If one country tests nuclear weapons, it could lead to a return of this practice. So let's strengthen the comprehensive test ban treaty and bring that into force. Question about U.S.-Russian relations. Worst situation since the Cold War. How do we get out of this? How do we start a dialogue? We must. If President Trump can talk to Kim Jong-un, which he plans to do in a month, he can certainly sit down and talk to President Putin. We have a lot of hard issues, but we need to talk and look for ways to reduce these global threats and enhance our mutual security, especially as it relates to arms control and nuclear weapons. And the final question is, how did you become a diplomat, and do you have advice? It's short answer, I took the Foreign Service exam. Different countries have different procedures, but the amazing thing, when I was young, there weren't very many opportunities to work internationally, and government service was just one of the few opportunities in journalism. But now there are so many opportunities to engage and work internationally on many of these issues. So I hope and encourage you to stay involved and seek international work.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Margarita Ryan.
Thank you. I picked up two questions based on the principle first come, first served. So first a question comes from Mr. Paul Bailey. Have research and analysis been done of potential unintended consequences of transformation? So as for the transformation of the exclusion zone and its consequences. We constantly provide investigations in relation to any activity within the exclusion zone, either on the construction of radioactive waste management facilities or any scientific project or creation of any related objects. So our work deals with a range of licenses, special permissions, etc. Any activity in the exclusion zone has to be justified, and there are no blind decisions. So the answer to your question is yes. The second one.
And Dr. Lynette.
Several questions. One has to do with fracking in the Marcellus Shale and the release of radon. The question is, what effects could increased radon have on prenatal development? And the simple answer is it has not been studied. I did mention the study of childhood leukemia in the UK, where radon hasn't been associated with bone marrow exposure, but radon does have many other exposures, and as I showed in the first slide, there's the lifetime perspective. Second question, what kinds of public health measures can we take to control how our children are exposed to radiation? And I think most of these really fall into the medical area, and I think the key answer is to ask a lot of questions about whether an exam is necessary. Now, one doesn't want to try to override an important clinically valuable examination, but I think by asking questions, one can ask the question, are alternative imaging measures available? And these are not available necessarily at all institutions, and it takes a long time, for example, to get an MRI, but the question should be asked. The last question I'm going to answer has to do with Chernobyl radionuclides dumped into the Black Sea, and how has this had an impact on the marine biota, and should this influence people who consume marine fishes from the Black Sea? That's a very good question. As many of you know, long-time mercury and lead exposures getting into fish. Pregnant women are advised not to eat fish from particularly those where there's mercury contamination. I think there's been too little study of the environment and the food chain, and this is an important question and requires further study.
Thank you, Dr. Lynette. Dr. Salk?
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to collapse the three questions that I've gotten. The first one had to do with education and its importance and how one deals with different regulations in different countries and how effect on public health and poverty. The second one was how do young people combat narrow, self-centered thinking? I'm being politically correct in reading that question. And finally, what's the best way the younger generation can help ensure a sustainable future? I'd say two things. First is a phrase that my father used frequently as I was growing up, which was, do what makes your heart leap. Look around at this world, you'll see something that draws you, some area to which you can contribute, to which you're drawn to contribute. Do that, follow that, do what's important to you, do what will help satisfy you, and that will end up making a good contribution to the world. Second thing has to do with education and how to combat narrow thinking. One has to do with our own selves. Education, to help educate people not only to know the details of the world, how to succeed in the outside world and the specifics, but how to deal with ourselves. Education should include getting to know our own selves on the deepest levels. If we can include that in the educational system for us, it not only will help in our own lives, if we can do that in communities, on local levels, that will help on those local levels, and to combat narrow thinking and on the part of government.
Thank you, Dr. Lynette. Dr. Goldstein.
Okay, good, thanks.
I suppose you have 5 minutes as a quote. My closing is going to be a response to these questions. This is a superb group of questions. I can't remember a better group through the years. Two relate to the Ukraine, and the first one I'll answer in a way that I wasn't sure I was going to answer until the the ambassador basically almost empowered me by his comments. And the question is, since Ukraine is now seen as a great source of technology innovation, would you support the creation of an incubator accelerator in Ukraine focused on green and clean technology? Well, of course. We need these all over. These incubators require something that a Perv talked about. Basically, it's the young who make the incubators work. I was fortunate in the 1970s to be part of a U.S.-Soviet exchange related to environmental science and managed to work in Kiev a bit. And we all recommend that you visit. And, the people are wonderful, and it's just a great place to be. But I was not impressed with the science. And I was not impressed with the science because it was all top-down in the old Soviet era. The people on top told the young people what research they should do and how they should do it. Incubators can't work that way. I'm sure it's changed dramatically, but it requires there to be the young people to have this leadership. Another one is, I'm going to read it in detail about the Ukraine. In reference to your positive image of Germany, how should its recent decision to approve the Nord Stream 2 pipeline be perceived by Ukrainians and others? This is a pipeline that has to do with the natural gas, in a sense, coming from and oil coming from from Russia, and what that means in terms of U.S. and other countries' policies. Let me go back to my reference to my positive image of Germany and be more blunt about Germany. If you spend time in Germany, you will not see the kind of car I drive, which is a Prius, except very rarely. The United States, I got that Prius in part because of a tax benefit that the U.S. government did for basically decreasing carbon dioxide output in part. That went to a Japanese car. There's no way that Germany or any European country I'm familiar with will ever give a tax benefit for something that might be very good for global climate change to a non-European or non-self countries' cars. That simply won't happen. Germany invested in diesel. Diesel is cheaper in Europe than it is in the U.S. than gasoline. And that's because that's where the tax benefit went. But the Europeans lead in diesel cars. They would not provide a tax benefit in that way. So it's the same thing with Nord Stream. We have to realize that that's the reality I was talking about. You're going to have both industry and government focusing on what helps them. Germany, in another way, uses 1990 as their baseline year for calculating how well they're doing on global climate change. Why would anyone use 1990? The answer is very simply that in 1989 there was a joint, the Berlin Wall fell, Germany and East Germany. East Germany was united, as the ambassador pointed out. The previous inefficient Eastern European energy sources now became part of the baseline. It's much cheaper to use a 1990 baseline for Germany because they've got these inefficient sources, and it's easier to get a % decline out of inefficiency than out of efficiency. So these are how countries will work. Finally, about culture, a lot of the questions were about cultural changes. I'm willing to bet that if I ask for a show of hands here among the young people, how many of you drive a car now, have a license that would be less than your parents or even your older siblings? Americans are moving far less frequently than we were before. Amazing change. Part of it may be due to both husband and wife are working. We're not sure why. But this is becoming less of a sprawl society because of those cultural changes, which may be partly related to we shouldn't all have two cars, may be partly related to what we've learned about the need to conserve energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein, for your excellent synopsis of what is going on. And now I give the floor to His Excellency.
Well, thank you. I didn't expect to have any concluding remarks. I just want to thank you once again, all of you, the audience. I see a lot of young faces, and I'm really hopeful that you will learn lessons from these 2.5 hours, or almost 3 hours. I myself learned a lot, and I'm thankful to you, Dr. Durbach, for doing this. Every year the topic is different. I even more appreciate the fact that this is one of the rare occasions when we don't just talk about the bad things which happened in Chernobyl 32 years ago, but we talk about the future and what can we do in order that not just this catastrophe never repeats once again, but how to use those bad things which happened to learn our lessons, like Fukushima, for example, and in many, many other areas which many of the panelists mentioned already. So thank you very much for selection of this every topic, and I'm already looking forward to participate in 2019 28th conference.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'm like a dog with a bone. When I get on a project, I continue it for a long time. But in conclusion, I would like to thank His Excellency for supporting this conference and for being with us today. I would also like to thank our excellent faculty. I'm not going to name each one of them, but I thought they were absolutely fantastic. I also like to thank our administrator, Fred, and our coordinator, Modu, all of our interns, and all of our board members, and finally to all of you for patiently listening and learning. And I didn't see any of you sleeping, so that was very, very pleasant for me. So have a very good afternoon, and the meeting is adjourned.